Hi guys, so my name is Divyansh Bhatia. I'm a student of Shahid Bhagat Singh College and this is my second video regarding non-resident taxable person, which further includes the registration process and how the returns are to be filed. I hope you find this video very helpful. Okay, so now moving on to the topic of non-resident taxable person in GST. This is a little different from casual taxable person. So now who is a non-resident taxable person? As defined by law, any person who occasionally undertakes transactions involving supply of goods or services or both, whether as principal or agent or any other capacity, but who has no fixed place of business or residence in India, that is the country of his own origin. The requirement under law, that is what is required by the law to be a non-resident taxable person. So according to section 24 of the GST law, which is for the requirement, it states that the requirement for registration for a non-resident taxable person, how the person is to be registered. So it mentions certain businesses and entities which are mandatorily required to register under goods and services tax and are not governed by the minimum threshold limit of 20 lakh or 10 lakh. Thus, irrespective of whether the business is involved in a one-time transaction or frequent taxable transactions, every non-resident individual or company will have to obtain a registration under the goods and services tax. That is, irrespective whether the business is a one-time transaction, the person or the company will have to, in any case, obtain a registration under the law. So now moving on to the registration procedure. So certain steps are required to be registered as a non-resident taxable person, which includes, so the first is every person or business who falls under the definition covered in the non-resident taxable person scheme needs to apply for registration at least 5 days before commencement of the business. Further clarification has been provided in case of a high C sale. Now, what is high C sale? A high C sale is a sale carried out by the carrier document consignee to another buyer while the goods are still being transported or after their dispatch from the port or airport of origin and before their arrival at the port or airport of the destination. Now, this was the meaning of high C sale. Now, in the case of high C sale, the law says that every person who makes a supply from the territorial waters of India shall obtain registration in the coastal state or union territory where the nearest point of the appropriate baseline is located. Now, the baseline which we are talking about is the nearest for the coastal or the same union territory. Now, next is a non-resident taxable person needs to electronically submit a duly signed application along with a self-attested copy of his valid passport for registration. Now we are moving on to the registration procedure. Using the form GST REG 09 at least 5 days prior to the commencement of business on the common portal. Now this was discussed earlier by me, that is 5 days prior to the commencement of business. Now this is to be done electronically in the form GSTR EG09. It should be duly self-attested and the application must be duly signed or verified through EVC, a new mode of electronic verification based on Aadhaar. If there is a non-resident and if it is a company, then it must submit its tax identification number of its original country from where it belongs and whatever is the equivalent of our PAN in that country. That is the permanent address number in that country in which the non-resident is making business. Now next is a person applying for registration as a non-resident taxable person will be given a temporary reference number electronically by the common portal, which I have mentioned before. Now this is a temporary reference number, not a permanent number, for making an advance deposit of tax in his electronic ledger, and an acknowledgement will be issued thereafter. Now about the advance deposit of tax, it will be discussed in the next slides. Moving on. Okay, so now there is the registration process. Now what happens and how it happens during the registration is mentioned here. So the first is the application for registration in form GST REG 09. So unlike a normal taxable person, a non-resident taxable person does not apply for registration in GST REG 01. In fact, a simplified form GST REG 09 is required to be filed by such a person in order to apply for GST registration. Further, the non-resident taxable person is required to submit an attested copy of his valid passport along with the application electronically. As I have told you earlier, such an application needs to be duly signed and verified through electronic verification code, that is the EVC. Now, as mentioned, there can be a circumstance where a non-resident taxable person is an entity registered outside India. In such a case, the business entity is required to submit its tax identification number or unique number along with the application for registration. Now, this number is with this number that the government of the foreign country would identify such an entity. Now the next step, or the next step in the registration process, is the signature of the authorized signatory on the application. This application for registration by a non-resident taxable person is required to be signed by an authorized signatory, and it is a person who is a resident of India having a valid PAN number. Now the next step in the process is the generation of the temporary reference number. Now TRN, as short of temporary reference number, is generated via the common portal once the PAN, the mobile number and the email address of the person applying for registration as a non-resident taxable person gets verified. Now moving on to the next one, it is the depositing advance tax. Under it, the non-resident taxable person is now required to deposit the mandatory advance tax using the TRN provided. And what was TRN? TRN was the temporary reference number. Now the TRN provided via the common portal. The tax amount such deposited equals approximate tax liability for the period for which the non-resident taxable person has availed registration. Now this tax amount gets credited in the electronic cash ledger of the applicant. Now the electronic cash ledger's use is made pretty clear in this point. Moving on to the next point, which is of the issuance of the registration certificate. Once the payment of advance tax gets reflected in the electronic cash ledger of the non-resident taxable person, the registration certificate is issued to him electronically. Now, the next step in the process is the validity of the registration certificate. For a non-resident taxable person can make supplies only after the registration certificate is issued. So registration certificate is mandatory. Now such a certificate is valid for a period as specified in the application for registration or 90 days from the date of registration, whichever is earlier. Moving on to the last step of the process is the extension of the registration period. A non-resident taxable person can seek to extend the period of registration so specified in his application for registration, but this is only a choice. So this is done by submitting an application electronically through the common portal in form GST REG 11. However, such an application for the extension must be made before the end of the validity of the registration. Also, the validity provided period of 90 days can be extended by a further period of no more than 90 days. Such an extension of the registration period is permitted only on the tax payment of additional advance tax. Now this advance tax amount equals the approximate tax liability, which will be discussed in detail in the next slides. Now, advance payment of tax. Now, what is advance payment of tax? So, there is a clause for the non-resident taxable person that allows him to, that requires him to make an advance deposit of tax in an amount equivalent to the estimated tax liability of such person for the period for which the registration is sought. So that person does not belong to a certain country but is managing business in the very same country. But before registration, he must know that for a certain period of time, his registration will be valid and he has to deposit the advance tax for the same by calculating the estimated tax liability. In other words, registration rules circulated by the GST Council have specified that every person registered as a non-resident taxable person is required to deposit tax in advance on presumption basis. And what is this presumption basis? That the person is presuming in advance for the period for which the registration is sought. Now, this advance tax will get credited into the electronic cash ledger and will eventually get adjusted against the actual tax liability at the time of return filing. So, when the return will be filed by the non-resident taxable person, this amount will be adjusted against the actual tax liability, which will happen in the future in the electronic cash ledger. Now, these rules further specify that in case a non-resident taxable person intends to extend the period of registration. Now they're talking about the extension of the period of registration, if at all required, indicated in their application of registration, which should be indicated in the application of registration when they are filing the form GST REG 09. They should mention specifically that they might need the extension for the period of registration. Now, an application using the form GST REG 11 should be furnished electronically through the common portal before the end of the validity of registration granted to him. So if at all he wants the extension, he shall file an application using the form GST REG 11, which is to be done same exactly electronically through the same common portal, but before the end of validity of registration granted to him. Now moving on to the illustration for the same, so that you guys can understand the topic well. Now, say there is a company named Mark Incorporation which is based out of USA, and they manufacture the special class turbojet engines which are supplied to India for assembling. Now the company is based in USA, but the assembling is done in India. So the domestic company is in USA. Then there is this is a one-time transaction for Mark Incorporation, and thus they have appointed an agent, Mr. Vinod, in India to carry out all compliance related formalities. Now, Mr. Vinod in turn is required to obtain registration. As I have told you earlier, registration is required and it is to be done by the agent, that is Mr. Vinod in India, for Mark Incorporation. Now, he has to furnish with his own PAN number and he has to pay advance tax related to this transaction. So now it is the duty of the agent to pay advance taxes and to provide with the PAN number to complete the transaction. Now, once the transaction is carried out successfully and the supply is made, Mark Incorporation will need to file their GST returns. Now, in the end, it is all about filing returns. So now they have to file GST returns and meet all the GST liability from the advance tax paid at the time of registration. Now, any tax paid in excess will be refunded through the electronic mode. Now, if we compare with the actual tax that has to be paid and the tax which they estimated, the advance tax, there might be a difference between the two taxes. Now, there will exist an excess amount, which is to be refunded through the electronic mode. I hope this illustration is clear to you all. Now, the returns to be filed by a non-resident taxable person. First point under this is a non-resident taxable person files a simplified return in the form of GSTR 5 for every calendar month. This return includes details pertaining to the following. First, the inward supplies, the supplies which are coming in. Then the outward supplies, that is the supplies going out. Then any interest, penalty, or any kind of fees. Then comes the tax payable or tax paid, or any other amount payable under the act, that is the GST Act. Now the earlier points made it really very clear that a non-resident taxable person is not required to file an annual return, because it stated under the form GSTR 5 that they are to file a return which is on the monthly basis, not the annual or the 12 months basis. Now he just needs to file a monthly return in form GSTR 5. This return can be filed either electronically through a common portal, as I have told you earlier, or facilitation center notified by the commissioner. Then the details in GSTR 5 need to be filed within a time period, that is earlier of within 20 days after the end of the calendar month, or within 7 days after the last date of validity of the registration. Now refund in case of non-resident taxable person. Now why there may be a need for refund? Refund may arise due to the possibility of the change in the estimated tax liability, because that person paid the advance tax, estimating the tax liability arising, and now the actual tax liability may be different. So under that, a non-resident taxable person is entitled to receive any balance advance tax paid by him after his tax liability is adjusted. However, this balance amount of advance tax gets refunded only if the non-resident taxable person has filed all tax returns for the period for which the registration was availed by such a person. Now we come to the end of our presentation. So I hope you guys found it useful. Thank you for watching.